Welcome to Civics and Coffee, a history podcast, the show all about United States history, delivered to you in the time it takes to enjoy your morning cup of coffee. I'm your host, Alicia, a historian trained in United States history with a passion for telling both the known and unknown parts of America's past. So grab your coffee and get ready for some bite-sized history. Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm excited to share this week's conversation with Kathleen Langone, the author of The Miniature Painter Revealed, which dives into the history of Gilded Age artist Amalia Küssner. Langone is an independent historian, author, and podcast host of People Hidden in History. I hope you all enjoy the conversation. Hello, everyone. Joining me today is Kathleen Langone. She is a freelance writer and host of the People Hidden in History podcast and recently wrote The Miniature Painter Revealed, Amalia Küssner's Gilded Age Pursuit of Fame and Fortune, which will be the focus of our conversation today. Welcome, Kathleen.
Hello there. I'm delighted to be here and to share the story of Amalia Küssner.
I'm so happy you're here, and I'm so happy you finally got the book done. I know we've talked about this before when I was a guest on your show. So let's dive right in. How did you come to writing about a miniature painter from the Gilded Age?
Well, as is true with many things, there were like maybe three different things that happened in my life that made this possible. I will briefly tell you that I started a podcast series in 2020. I think many of us sort of did our dream projects or things we wanted to do because we had a little pause in our life in 2020. And my first podcast was about Amalia Küssner. Now, I did know about her because I'm distantly related, but I knew very little about her. And I heard a little bit growing up, and then I pretty much forgot about her for many years. When I did the research about her for the podcast, there was just a cornucopia of information on the internet. Of course, at this point in time, there are many, many online documents, magazine, newspapers that were online and scanned in. I had a lot of those subscriptions like newspapers.com, etc. So I just saw that there was an incredible amount of information on her. So I made the podcast. And then I was lucky to present about her at a couple of places. And one place that I did present, which was the New York Adventure Club, they wanted the presentation to be about 90 minutes. And after I had done about 90 minutes worth of content, I thought, you know what? I've got the start of a book here. And I started thinking about how I would do the book. I did a rough outline. And I was very fortunate to be contacted by a publisher. And the rest is history.
Wow. And so for those who might not know, who was Amalia Küssner and how did she enter the art world?
So Amalia Küssner, she had a very interesting life. She was born in Indiana in 1863. Her mother was Emily Weinhardt, and that's how I'm related to her through the Weinhardt side of the family. And she was born into a middle-class family. They were neither poor nor rich, but it was a very artistic family. Her father was a composer of music a little bit, and his business was repairing musical instruments. In fact, her older brother, Albert, became a renowned composer of piano music in the later 1900s. But it was obvious that Amalia had artistic talent. And again, her parents being sort of, cultural and artistic, really encouraged this. Sent her to a local Catholic girls' school where there was a nun who was very adept at art instruction. And she sort of took Amalia under her wing. And after that, after high school, she was sent to what I would call a finishing school in New York City in around 1882. And this was at the height of the Gilded Age. She got more art lessons there. She then went back to her hometown in Indiana, and I would say for about 7 or 8 years, started her miniature portrait business. And at this time, miniature portraiture was coming back in vogue. And, I think she pretty much exhausted who she could paint in the Midwest. She had an opportunity to go to New York City. She had a friend there that was an actress on Broadway, of all things. And she went to New York City now in 1892, and she was very, very good at promoting herself. So between her own rather bold personality and connections with this friend of hers who was an actress, She got exposed to society, and her career took off like a meteor.
Wow. And can you share a little bit about what distinguished Amalia from other miniature artists?
I would say her style was very romantic and almost Baroque. If you look at her miniatures, well, first of all, the women are wrapped in fabric. Very few of her miniatures show people in their, either their ball gowns or their street clothes or whatever. She would actually wrap her sitters in like tulle or satin or velvet. Again, it gave it a very Baroque appearance. And often this wrapped fabric would expose, their shoulders and their chest. There's one miniature I saw where you could see the woman's breast is very sort of racy, but very lovely. And not only did she make these women appear very romantic and a little bit sexy, sometimes on their faces, she would improve them a little bit. Some of the women she painted, maybe their faces were plump. She actually would thin the faces down. She would do what we would call photoshopping back in the 1890s. And I think it was this sort of glamorous view of women that distinguished her from other miniature portrait artists at the time. I will add, Alicia, that she was probably the vanguard to bring miniature portrait art back to popularity in the United States. So she was really the first in the 1890s, and then women followed after her.
Yeah, and one of the things you talk about in covering her life is not only her bid in the United States, but also she did get some success overseas. And so I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about Amalia's trip to St. Petersburg in 1899?
Oh, sure. That's one of her more exciting trips. She got a benefactor whose name was Minnie Paget. Minnie Paget had married into British royalty. She was very well to do, and she had connections not only with the British aristocracy, but with the Russians, and this would have been the Romanovs at the time. She got Amalia an invite to go over and paint the Romanov family, and she had the opportunity to paint both the Tsar and also the Tsarina, and this would have been Nicholas II and Alexandra. And what's interesting, and of course I talk about this in the book, I knew that this was a significant trip in part because already things were politically fraught there. As early as 1899, I think the Tsar was always concerned about, somebody trying to kill him, etc. So I think for them to bring her in, and she was actually with the family off and on for 3 weeks, they really appreciated her talent, and she became a friend of sorts, even with Tsarina Alexandra.
Yeah. And Amalia Kusner kind of travels the world. She went to St. Petersburg. How does the trip to St. Petersburg differ from another trip she took, this time to Africa?
So the trip to St. Petersburg was in March of 1899. And again, it was very interesting. She was very much involved with the lives of the Romanovs. But you're now talking about a trip she took in October of that year. I often talk about 1899 as her year of adventure. She always wanted to paint Cecil Rhodes. Now, Cecil Rhodes at this point, we think of him as the diamond magnate of South Africa. He had been involved in politics there. He sort of ran afoul and I think was taken out of his political role, but he was very much involved in the business of the Kimberley diamond mines. So Amalia does get an invite. She takes a ship down to Cape Town, South Africa. And when she arrives to go to paint Cecil Rhodes, he has already left for the Kimberley compound, which is some distance away because the Boer War is about to start. Now, Amalia is fully aware of this and there could be some danger involved. So what does she do? She hops on a train, and I think it's like 300 miles away. She arrives at the Kimberley compound, and everybody is aware that the war is about to start. Cecil Rhodes regretfully lets her in, but he does, let her in because it's a safety issue now. But it all works out, and she's able to paint his portrait. They become friends of sorts. And immediately after she arrives, the Boers blow up the train tracks going into this area. So she's stuck there for close to 3 months.
Yeah. I loved the journey that you take us on with Amalia and these powerful men and getting a chance to see their more vulnerable side. So I appreciate you talking a little bit about those two trips. And one thing that definitely comes through in the writing is that Amalia was a bit of a free spirit, but she does eventually get married. So can you talk about her decision to get married?
Yeah, that's a very interesting topic, and there's certainly some mystery around that. So let's rewind the tape a little bit. When she arrives in New York City in 1892, soon thereafter, she lies about her age. She says she's around 20, and she's just about 30. And in that day and age, if you're a single woman at 30, you're getting into old maid territory. So she did, appear to be younger, and that sort of gave her a mystique. Here you had this woman, barely 20, painting these beautiful miniatures, etc. Her time in New York for most of the 1890s, I think she was very focused on her career. I think there were, and I do write about one particular man that was interested in her, but she really was very career focused. But the one thing she couldn't do is, as a single woman, and she came, of course, from this middle class background, she couldn't really break into the echelons of society. And she met this gentleman, Charles Dupont Coderre. I think he fell in love with her. They met in 1896. I think she married him eventually in 1900 as a marriage of convenience. They did stay married for many years, but I think she was a bit of a social climber in her marriage to him.
Yeah. And you mentioned briefly that, a lot of her time in New York was spent trying to get into social society and not having a whole lot of luck, which is a perfect segue to the next question that I had for you, which was, how did her experiences differ between her attempting to have this social climbing in New York and how she was treated overseas?
Yeah, that's an interesting topic that this sort of became clear as I delved into writing the book. There was an extremely stratified social structure in New York City. We know about Mrs. Astor, the 400, etc. Ironically enough, even though she married into this family, the Coderre family, that were very prominent in the law scene in New York City, they were Catholic and they could not be part of the 400. In England, where she went first when she went overseas and actually ended up staying there the rest of her life, there really wasn't this stratification. I think people really appreciated her artistic talent. She certainly had a very outgoing personality. And initially, she sort of became part of Edward VII's social circle. So that gave her a lot of entrees into many titled women, etc. So she was really treated as somebody higher in society, and people who were very established in royalty would give her teas and parties. So it was a very different life for her over there.
Yeah. And Kustner has a connection to a pretty famous artist. So how did Amalia come to know Rodin?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting story. So you first must know that her husband had 6 sisters, and some of them were a bit wild. But one sister had actually married, I think, into German royalty, but she got exposure to Auguste Rodin, which at this time was already obviously a very established sculptor, etc. And there was some chemistry there, though I think Rodin was married at this time. This sister of her husband's was certainly married at this time, and she effectively became his mistress. And after that relationship was established, she brought in Amalia and her husband, Charles Dupont Coderre, to do a miniature of Rodin. And in fact, though it's not in the book, in the family, we actually have a signed photograph of Rodin from that time period.
Oh, wow. That's
Mhm.
really cool. So, maybe it's just my algorithm on social media, but it feels as if the Gilded Age is having a moment thanks to the HBO series, which I think is so well done. I'm so excited. I'm happy that we're going to get a 4th season. But one question that I have for you is, how does or what does Amalia's experience tell us about women specifically during the Gilded Age?
I think something that's come through very, very clearly, that there were very few women that could pursue careers, and those that did either did it very carefully or were more bold like Amalia. One of the things that Amalia did, she demanded to have commission rates equal to that of men, which is very unusual in that day and age. But the other thing, certainly a lot of social circles, you had to be a bit of a beautiful woman to get ahead.
Hmm.
Amalia was certainly a beautiful person, and I think that actually helped her career. If you look at many of the backgrounds of the women that she painted some of the most beautiful women in England, certainly some of the most beautiful women in America. And I will add, though, that when she painted Mrs. Astor, who maybe was not traditionally beautiful, she did beautify her a little bit and thin her face out. But there were certain strictures and rules you sort of had to stay within to succeed as a woman at that time.
Yeah, and I'm curious, you spent a lot of time working on this. What was something that surprised you in your research process?
I think that she was so incredibly documented in magazines and newspapers, yet very few people know about her now. She's in very few museums.
Mhm.
And when I was getting towards the end of the book, it kept, niggling at me. Why is it that she is not more well known? Why is she not in museums? And I think two things were that after she sort of started the fad of miniature artwork again in the United States, these societies sprung up that were associated with museums. Let's say the American Miniature Artists Society. She chose not to join those societies because when they started, she already had a very impressive career. She was getting a lot of money for her commissions, and I think she felt she didn't need those. But what those would do, they would have art shows and art exhibits, and things would get awarded. And then those miniatures that got awarded would go into museums. And the women that went into the museums would get known historically. So I think that's part of the reason that she got lost in history.
Just too much of a wild child and going her own way.
Very definitely.
And so I am curious about your research process. I know you started this during the pandemic when much of the world was locked down. So can you talk a little bit about that? How did you find your material on Kushner? How did you decide to frame the story? What questions did you ask? Tell us everything.
Sure. I was very fortunate, and a lot of these resources are obviously still there now. All the online, scanned in magazines and books and newspapers that were there, I would say maybe 70, 80% of my material came in from these sites, some of which are paid for. I also use the Internet Archive, which was then and is still now free. And I also connected with some very, very distant relatives who very, very generously lent me some family photos of Amalia and her husband. I have a letter from Amalia's brother that was written very late in her marriage, just a few years before she died, that wrote how devoted her husband was to her all those years. I think that was an important thing to include in the book. So it was just a combination of things. And again, my thanks to people who gave me photos that really enriched this book.
Yeah. And was there anything from your research that you just felt like I don't have enough evidence to include, or do you feel like you got everything you could into the pages?
Something that's still unclear to me was, did she really date anybody or have any love interests before she married in 1900? I did find a brief mention that Nikola Tesla, the inventor, was interested in her. There were a couple of women, I think it was recorded maybe 1898, that he was interested in. And of these three women, Amalia was one. And I couldn't find much more than a reference in his biography. But I'm just wondering if there were other people that she was interested in. I don't know if we'll ever know.
Yeah. Maybe for the sequel.
I know, I wouldn't mind that.
And so what do you hope readers take away from this book?
I think that they will see that she was an amazingly accomplished woman. And one message about her life that I think that can apply to anybody is it's okay to promote yourself if you have talents, whoever you are, man, woman, child, whatever. It's really good to tell people about them. We shouldn't be bashful or shy to tell the world that we're good at what we do. So that's one thing. But also the complexity of her character. I know that she was very dedicated to her family, and some of the women that she painted, I think she became lifelong friends to. But she had a little bit of the snobbery that was typical in the Gilded Age. And, she, I think, had this lifelong desire to be accepted in these other upper echelons of society. So when all is said and done, I think there were many different sides to her personality, and she was really never any one of those things. She was a bit like a chameleon and would change in the environment to suit her purposes.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that I enjoyed so much about this book is getting that inside look into your your unknown, quote unquote, woman from the Gilded Age, somebody who was on the outside world of society with, had a couple of fingers in there. And I just think you do such a great job in kind of illustrating the moment, illustrating the period, and then showing how Küsner both jived with and kind of made her own way. So props for that.
Thank you.
And where should people go when they've finished the book and they want to learn more about you, your podcast? I want to give you time to talk about your podcast, and all the stuff that you do.
So I do have a book website. It's a very simple address. It's just KathleenLangone.com. And I have links in there to just about any online place that you could purchase the book. So that would be great. And the podcast series, there are actually 2 podcasts in there about Amalia if you'd like to listen to something, hopefully in addition to buying the book. But right now we have about 31 episodes in that podcast series that cover mostly U.S. history from the 1600s up until 1960. So, just jump in if you enjoy history. I think you'll find something there that you like.
Lovely. And is there anything that we haven't talked about today that you want future readers or future listeners to know?
Well, I think one of the biggest mysteries about her life that I have yet to crack is she had a mysterious lawsuit lodged against her just about a year after she got married. In fact, I was even down in New York City through the archival legal records to see if I could find information. And we actually found an index card that showed the date that the lawsuit was filed against her, but the actual paperwork was missing. So, and there was never anything in newspapers because everything documented said that everybody was very mum about this. The lawyers wouldn't talk about this. So I'm still curious as to what this lawsuit was, and I'm assuming it may have been some sort of indiscretion.
Oh, very, very mysterious indeed. Well, for the listeners out there, be sure to pick up your copy of The Miniature Painter Revealed. It is a great book. I think it's also very timely, like I said, considering that I think that the Gilded Age itself is having a moment in history, and especially the women of the Gilded Age. So I think your book could not be more timely. It's beautifully written. You breeze right through it. I got through it in just a few afternoons of sitting. So, very well done. And also definitely check out her podcast, The People Hidden in History. It's a great show. I might be biased because I was on there before.
Yes, you were.
But before we let everybody go, is there anything else you want to leave listeners with, Kathleen?
No, I'm just very thankful, like you said, that the timing is unbelievable with this HBO series. As you mentioned, they've been renewed for a 4th season. And I will briefly add that Amalia painted many of the characters. She painted Mrs. Astor. She painted Consuelo Vanderbilt, Mrs. Fish. So they're in the book.
Yeah. So pick it up today so you can get a little bit more tea about your favorite characters. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Kathleen.
Thank you. This was a joy.
My thanks again to Kathleen for spending her time with me. And if you've been enjoying the HBO series The Gilded Age and want to explore the life of one of its players, I recommend grabbing a copy of The Miniature Painter Revealed. It is a great story about a fascinating woman. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you Saturday. Thanks for sitting down with me as I explored this chapter of American history. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe and share with your friends. I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.